Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 1. This is part 2 of the Shir, and the art scroll we're on 2A1. Today we're getting into the differences between Gitten, which are going to be gets, and also Truma. There is a difference. Now, Rabbi Yochanan in this conversation has a rule. And the idea is that the Torah, as we were learning in part 1 of the Shir, makes a specific requirement for thought when it's talking about Truma. And that means, and the sages are saying, that somebody who's mentally incompetent, like a minor or a deranged person, he can demonstrate intention, but there has to be something with the act as well as some sort of intention and understanding. Otherwise, it is not valid. So we saw in the end of part 1 that when dealing with hechsher, which is like, let's say your fruit gets moistened and you did it with intention to prepare it, well, that shows that you took a legally significant act to start the food processing, in that case drying figs on your rooftop. So that if a mentally incompetent person went and took that legally significant action, that's a physical action that prepares it for food processing. Now, they were saying that that is going to be one category of action, but they're putting out here that there's another category of action. This other category of action is when you're doing something that has a spiritual component to it. In other words, when you're separating out truma, this pile of truma here looks the same as that pile of truma over there. Now, when you're putting the figs on top of the rooftop to start to dry, they're going to get moistened with dew. That's a physical thing. They have physically changed and become moistened. But over here with the truma, this and that look different. And they're saying that the Torah is writing the word thought, and that the word thought is conveying an idea for something spiritually relevant. In other words, when you are separating this from that or consecrating an animal for a sacrifice at the altar, that now what you've done is you've done something with a spiritual designation. It doesn't have a physical transformation or changed like what we're doing with hechsher. But then it says, well, wait a second, but Gitten also requires intent, and in fact, we're seeing over there in the laws that somebody who is mentally incompetent cannot make a get, can't write a get. So in the terminology in the Torah, it's using the word la for get, and it's not using the word for thought, not mentioning thought. So Rabbi Yochanan was considering the get to be invalid if the person's intention isn't there. And what's going to be the difference? Because the Torah does not mention the word thought regarding a get. So that's going to be the theme of where we're going. So the Gemara continues from where we were leaving off, and Rabbi Yochanan questions what Rav Huna was talking about before to try to explain in regards to the Yerushalmi and Gitten 2.5, and he's basically trying to address this, the difference between a get and truma, and basically he's implying like this: can the Mishnah, says Rabbi Yochanan, possibly mean that a get written by a mentally incompetent individual is valid because there is a competent individual standing over him? And again, at the end of part 1 of the Shir, Rav Huna is basically pointing out and saying, look, the person who's standing over this person here is mentally incompetent, but the person who actually has the intent to write the get for this mentally incompetent person is a mentally competent scribe. Now that is going to be like the shliach, is going to be like an agent. So maybe that should be okay. So Rabbi Yochanan's questioning this, though. He's saying, why is it written that he, the husband, writes for her a divorce document, which is teaching that a get must be written for her sake? In other words, in Beurim 24:1, it's saying that he, the husband, writes for her a document, a get. So the question is, well, maybe that means that there has to be specific intent for the woman being divorced. It has to be lishma. In other words, a mentally incompetent individual can't provide this sort of intent. So Rabbi Yochanan is objecting to Rav Huna's explanation of that Mishnah in Gitten to, again, look at the difference between Truma and a get. And basically, when you have a competent person standing over an incompetent person to instruct them, and then the incompetent person writes the get in accordance with the instructions, that would be, correctly filling in the names for the husband and the wife. Then the actions of the incompetent is going to demonstrate that he does have an intent to write it for the sake of the woman. Now, in the Chatam Sofer, in his Chuvos, he's saying that although the intent of the competent person guiding the incompetent is ineffective, it's saying let the intent of the incompetent himself be effective. In other words, he's demonstrating by his actions of following the instruction to write for the sake of this couple. And so, since Rabbi Yochanan is going to consider this kind of get invalid, we're seeing that according to Rabbi Yochanan, we do not rely on somebody's action to demonstrate that the intent is valid. So the question goes back to what about thought? And we're going to see here the difference between this and that.
In Numbers 18:27 is saying that, and your truma shall be reckoned to you like the grain from your threshing floor and like the wine from the winepress. Now, the Torah is using the word ve'nechashev, and that is being either reckoned or like thought. And Rabbi Yossi at the end of part 1 of this year yesterday was basically pointing out that gets don't have that word in there. They don't have thought. Now, as we were covering in part 1 of this year, the idea is that there's a difference between regular actions and a difference between actions that carry a spiritual component. Now, certainly the get has a spiritual component. Now, after hearing this, Rabbi Yossi says this Gemara retracts his question, and he says that there, in the case of the get, this one writes it and needs to have the improper intent. In other words, the husband doesn't write the get. He has the agent do it. The sofer is the one who writes the get. And that's going to be a little bit different. So, and who's writing it with the proper intent? Who has the thought? It's the sofer. The sofer is given the instruction, and then it's the sofer who has the proper intent to write it. And that's, by the way, in the halacha, why you can't pre-write a bunch of gets and then just come in and fill in names. It has to be done specifically for a specific person. And the Gemara continues and says, while that one then divorces the wife with it. In other words, the difference is that the husband issues the command to the sofer. The sofer writes it with the intent. He's the one who conveys the thought. He gets the document. He hands it over to the woman. In the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi goes on to point out another difference between the get and truma. He says, however, here, in the case of truma, the one who needs to have the intent is the very one who is separating and designating the truma. Now, the idea is that the intent is effective for himself, and that's one of the things that you're going to see that's going to be different from the guy who's writing the get on behalf of the husband and the person over here who's taking out with the intent lishma. He's taking out the intent. He has the kavanah. He's doing it for himself. And the idea is that the term for thought is basically where the idea is he has the intent for himself, and we're relying on his action because of that to validate that action and that intention, and that's going to be why thought is used there for truma. Now, the Or Sameach has a really great explanation about this. He's saying over in his commentary in the Hilchas Mikvos in 1.8, Save 12, he's saying that yes, there is a difference between the cases of a get and truma, and on the surface, he's saying that there's a preliminary act, and that's done on behalf of another person, and separating truma is a final act, and it's done on one's own behalf. So everything there, that's true. But the Or Sameach adds something. He says that the underlying difference with respect to whether one's action can prove his intention lies in the rule that for a get to be written lishma, it must be written with the husband's instruction. And if a scribe writes a get on his own with the intention that it should be used for the divorce of a specific husband and a wife, it is not considered lishma, because there's no basis to assume that the husband intends to divorce his wife with that document. And only when the husband orders the get is the scribe's writing deemed to have the quality of lishma, and only then is it considered to be actually written for this divorce. Now, he adds and he continues and he says that when the mentally incompetent individual writes a get, even if he correctly enters the name of the husband and the wife, his action demonstrates that he personally is writing and his intent is for the divorce, but his action is an action, but it does not demonstrate that he's writing it on account of the husband's instruction. And so the act of writing does not provide evidence that it includes this quality of kavanah and lishma. And in the case of truma, though, all that is necessary is that the act itself be done with the proper kavanah. There's no requirement that it be done in accordance with another person's instructions. And therefore, when the incompetent individual actually separates the right amount of truma, his action demonstrates the validity of his intention to perform the proper truma separation. And that's going to be, says the Or Sameach, the meaning of Rabbi Yossi's statement that in the case of the get, this one writes it while that one divorces. And in the case of truma, the one who intends it is the one who separates it. In other words, that the person who is writing the get is not the one handing over the divorce document. That's done by the husband. So there's a separation between intent. In other words, you can have a crazy person ask the scribe to write this with intent, and now the scribe is the one writing it with intent. Now, the action can be done with a get that's kosher by the bet din overseeing the crazy person to hand it over. But what we're seeing here is that Rabbi Yochanan's rule that where the Torah does not explicitly require thought for an incompetence action can demonstrate his intention, and that implies only where he himself is impacted by this issue. So since it's relevant to himself, he applies himself fully to the task, and if we observe him acting intelligently, we can assume that he has the required intent. And if he's doing something on behalf of someone else, we can't assume that he has the proper intention. So even if he appears to be acting intelligently, we're not sure. But in the case of truma, Rabbi Yochanan is pointing out that truma refers to someone who is separating it from his own produce. And if the Torah had not written the word thought, the action of the incompetent, and this is explained by the Mara Fulda, the Mara Panim, and Rabbi Kanievsky from his Beur shiurim, he's basically saying that the case of truma refers to someone who's separating it from his own produce. And so if the Torah did not write the word thought, the action of an incompetent person would be enough to demonstrate his intention. And similarly, in the case of heksher, where thought is not written in the Torah, and that's referring to someone who moistens his own produce, that intention of an incompetent person is enough to demonstrate intention. But here, in the case of the get, when somebody writes on behalf of the husband, who will then use it to divorce the wife, since that act is not relevant to the incompetent himself, we can't rely on his action to demonstrate that he has a proper intention. And the Hatam Sofer has a great explanation about this. He's saying that in the cases of truma and heksher, that they do not necessarily involve the incompetent's own produce. Rather, since the action achieves the end result, which is the actual truma designation or the tuma preparation, we can rely on his action to demonstrate his intention. But the case of the get is different because his action of writing, says the Chatam Sofer in his Chuvos, is that we can rely on his action to demonstrate the intent over there for separating truma, but over here, there's someone else who prepares a document. And since the incompetent does not perform the final act, and he's just taking a preliminary act, and the sofer is the one who's actually writing this with the intent, the action does not have the gravity to demonstrate that it's the incompetent who has the proper intention throughout this process. In other words, part of the process is done by somebody who actually is competent. So Rabbi Yochanan has a little bit different explanation on how this is going and the difference between the case of the get and the case of Truma, and the differences between it. And there's another Amora who agrees with Rabbi Yossi's answer and retraction, which ultimately is going to support Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says that why, if the incompetent individual would write the get himself and then proceed himself to divorce the wife with it, it would be a valid get. But that is only when he is writing a get for another person that his action cannot demonstrate the validity of its intention. So, in other words, says the Chatam Sofer, when writing a get for his own divorce, we can rely on his action to demonstrate the validity of his intention since it's relevant to himself. And since he performs not only the preliminary act of writing the get, but also the final act of giving it, when he gives it, we retroactively have enough evidence that he had proper intention from the outset. Now, there's other questions. Well, are and when is a mentally incompetent person fit to divorce his wife? And there's a lot of issues on this in the Halacha, and don't read this as necessarily halacha l'maisa. Now, the halachic consensus is that there's no instance of a marriage for a minor, and also what about for a deaf mute, or what about for a kinyan to create a marital bond, or what about for a crazy person, right? So, in the case of divorce by an incompetent, by biblical law, let's say a deaf mute can't affect marriage or divorce, but the rabbis instituted marriage for a deaf mute, and likewise they instituted that a deaf mute can become married, and he also, by the way, can sever his rabbinic marriage with a get. But over here, what about the deranged person? And so, if we have a deranged person, and he's incapable of the required will, then, the question is he even capable of understanding and intending what he's doing? Does he have the Kavanah, and maybe he's also not capable of having the will to affect kinyan. So there's a lot of issues going on over here, and again, don't read this as a playbook on what is actually going to be the halacha l'maisa, but the idea by Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha has a lot of implications. He's implying that a mentally incompetent person, in some cases, can divorce his wife. In other words, why? Because he's saying, well, what if the incompetent person's writing his own get? He's not outsourcing it to a sofer who has intention. So the Gemara continues and says, and here, the one who needs to have the intent is the same one who's separating and designating truma. So the idea is that you can have cases where, look, if the person who's designating and saying the bracha and separating truma and has intention, and he's taking out the proper amount, well, taking out the proper amount does have significance. That's what the Chatam Sofer is saying, and to explain this, and that he went through the entire process himself. So Chatam Sofer would be saying, well, retroactively, it's demonstrated that he had Kavanah through it. He took proper action, and he went through the required steps, but he did all of them. And that's the key point of Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha. He's basically making a twist in it and saying, okay, very nice, Rabbi Yossi, that you're talking about somebody else writing the get, but we're talking now about what if the person comes and goes through the whole process himself, he writes the get himself, he hands the divorce himself. Is that going to be a legally binding thing? Now, why is this in here? Well, this is creating and showing that there is a difference, right? There is a difference between when somebody is separating out truma and he's carrying out all the processes, or if somebody is outsourcing this step to someone else to write the get, and then he gets the get back, and now he goes and hands it to the appropriate woman. So that, this and that are not exactly the same. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha is basically coming and saying, no, I'm going to make the case of this get the same. This incompetent person is coming and he's doing all the steps. He's writing it. He's the sofer and he's giving it. Now what? So the question is, he's basically implying, if not for the fact that this verse of thought in the Torah regarding Truma, his action would demonstrate that the intent would be valid and that the action would be valid. But that's the subtlety here, right? The subtlety that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha is pointing out is he's saying, well, wait a second, maybe because the word thought is over here, and even if he's coming through to go through the entire process himself, maybe it's still not valid. Now, that's going to be a suffix, and there's a lot of Rishonim who argue with it. Certainly the Chatam Sofer is saying, was there, significant and sufficient evidence that he had proper intention from the outset retroactively, and that's what he's saying. And again, part of the difference is that now this incompetent person went through the entire process himself. That's a question. Now, the Mishnah rules without any qualification that the truma separation of a deaf mute or deranged person or a minor is not valid, and that implies that this holds true in all circumstances. But the Gemara is actually going to take an opposing view. And Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha cites Rabbi Kia, who says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that there are people who dispute this teaching. In other words, they're going to hold that the truma separation of a mentally incompetent individual can sometimes be valid. And according to that view, if the incompetent person separates truma in the presence of a competent individual who instructs him, the truma separation is valid. Now, we can have similar cases where an incompetent person writes the get and he gives the get, but he's under supervision of the bet din. That has a case in Gitten, and that's going to be ruled to be a valid divorce and a valid get. And so we're going to have something similar over here. What if you have a bet din watching this guy separate it, and okay, he's crazy, but he takes out an inappropriate amount, and then they tell him, no, you got to have this amount. So he fixes it, and he adds it or changes it a little bit, and he comes up with the correct amount. Or what if, even better, they tell him take out 1/40th, and he takes out something like 1/40th by estimation, and it's about right. And they tell him what the bracha is, and he says the bracha. Well, isn't that kind of like the sofer writing and your hand is on the sofer's hand, like if somebody is writing a Torah scroll? In other words, whose kavanah was there? So the Gemara is going to clarify this statement that is also going to be related to the deeper point of Rabbi Yochanan that we started with. And the Gemara says, what is the meaning of all this? And it's as follows. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan's statement here regarding Terumos and that the Mishnah's ruling is disputed accords with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, in his dispute regarding Kiddushin with the rabbis. Now, over there, the Gemara is going to talk about what this dispute is, and basically it's saying that the act of Kiddushin done by a mentally incompetent person, if now it is done with the instruction of a competent individual, is that going to be valid or not? So Rabbi Yishmael is going to consider that act effective. The rabbis are going to consider it ineffective. And what Rabbi Yochanan is stating here in the context of Terumos is that there are disputants to our Mishnah's ruling, which, by the way, rejects truma separation by an incompetent. And he's referring to the opinions of Rabbi Yishmael. In other words, he's trying to tell us that Rabbi Yishmael validates an incompetence act of Kiddushin if it's done under the instruction of a competent. And so too over here, he's going to validate a truma separation performed under these same circumstances. So Rabbi Yochanan is trying to inform us that the halacha accords with Rabbi Yishmael, not with this Mishnah. So the Mara Fulda is going to say that if an incompetent person separates truma under the instruction of a competent individual, the truma is valid. Now, the Chatam Sofer is going to agree with that. And again, the idea is that in Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha's last case, if the get is written by the mentally incompetent person, and he performs all of the acts. He writes the get. He also does the final act of giving the get. And, the question is, now if there was supervision, certainly was that done? And so, according to what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, the Chatam Sofer would be saying that, yes, that is definitely going to be a valid chain of events that triggered a legally significant action like a divorce. Now, the Gemara continues and says that Rabbi Yochanan's statement that there will be regarding the status of incompetent is going to be in context of a get, and that's going to accord with the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, regarding Kiddushin. Now, we're going to get back to Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha citing Rabbi Yochanan, where a disqualifying get can be written by an incompetent individual, and now, what happens if it's under instruction of a competent individual? Now, in the case that we started with Rabbi Yosei was saying, what if you have the crazy person ask the sofer to write it, and now the sofer is mentally competent? This is a little different. This is saying, well, what happens if the whole chain of events is done by the crazy person, but now under supervision? He's done all of it. He even wrote it. He wrote the get, he handed the get, and that's, kind of like where we're going now, because the question is, well, would that be the same in Kiddushin? Would that be the same with also separating out Truma? Because now there is a thing of thought. So I want to just point out that Rabbi, in this according to Or Sameach, but the idea is that Rabbi Yochanan holds that a mentally incompetent person cannot write a get even under the instruction of a competent individual, because the writing lacks the element of lishma. And so Rabbi Yochanan is saying that a person cannot give his wife a get to divorce her even if it was written by a competent individual. And this is because, unlike the Truma separation, which requires only awareness and Kavanah, executing divorce requires ratzon, which is going to be will to effect it. And the mentally incompetent person is not capable of having that kind of will. And even if he's coached by a competent person. Now, that's what the Or Sameach says about this. And again, there's some question as to what is going to be exactly the halacha l'maaseh. As I understand it, that a bet din has to be involved in supervising it and trying to figure out what to do, because there's also a range of crazy here. So this gets into some very complicated thing. And again, this is not always going to be necessarily the halacha l'maaseh, but these are putting out the main issues. And there is a dispute regarding Kiddushin. And there was a brisa that was taught like this, says this Gemara, that if a deaf person, deaf mute, so that they can't speak and they can't hear, and you have a deranged person or a minor perform Kiddushin, their Kiddushin is not a valid Kiddushin under any circumstances. Now, Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, says that if it is performed between themselves without the presence of a competent individual who instructs them, their Kiddushin is not a valid Kiddushin. But if it is performed among themselves and others in the presence of a competent individual who does instruct them, their Kiddushin is a valid Kiddushin. So when Rabbi Yochanan, the Amarah, stated in the context of Truma that our Mishnah's ruling is disputed, he meant that it's disputed by Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, who, by the way, is a Tana. And he's validating that act of a mentally incompetent individual when it's performed under the guidance of a competent individual. And when he was talking about a get, he has a question about a get, because now a get has to have this other concept with ratzon, which is going to be will. Now, what do we do with will? And the get is going to be a little bit different, maybe than the act of Kiddushin. So the Gemara is going to look at the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan the Amarah regarding the get. And there was a brisa that taught that if a deaf mute separated Truma or he wrote a get and divorced his wife, his get is not a valid get. So the idea here is that under biblical law, that get is not valid. And if he had or was originally competent and then he got married and then somehow he became a deaf mute, he can't divorce his wife. And similarly, if somebody who was a deaf mute, if they, were trying to write a get and they were doing it for a competent person, would that be valid? No. So under rabbinic law, a deaf mute can marry, but there's a lot of complexity to that, and you can check out in Bavli and Gitten 71a for it. And but the idea here is, we're seeing that maybe there's a difference between kiddushin, maybe we're seeing a difference between the get, and maybe we're seeing a difference between truma. Now, this brisa says that his get is not a valid get, and it says that his truma is not a valid truma. And this is going to, by the way, represent the opinion of the Tanna Kama, who's applying this rule to the deaf mute, whether he was either born this way or he became a deaf mute later in life. And according to the Tanna Kama, nothing can be done to validate the actions of this individual, not even instruction by a mentally incompetent person. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees with the Tanna Kama, and he says that in what case of the deaf mute were these words stated? And he's saying that this is going to be regarding a case where he was a deaf mute from the outset. And this, by the way, is famous. This comes up in other places, not only in Gitten, but also in other things in the Shas, where Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that the definition of the deaf mute is going to be where he has to have been born this way and never saw the sun, the moon, or anything like that. So the case comes up elsewhere. Can a deaf mute go ahead and be a shliach tzibor and do the recitation of things like the Shema? And will it count? Can he dispatch the obligation for a congregation? And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that if the deaf mute has never been able to see these things, then he can't do it because he himself doesn't have the will or the Kavanah or the understanding of what he's saying. He's saying the words, but he doesn't understand what they mean because he's never actually seen it. And so this comes up many times in the Shas, and it comes up over here as well. He's basically saying that if this person was a deaf mute, and this is going to be talking about a case where they were always a deaf mute, and then it continues and says, if there was a time, when somebody was competent and he became a deaf mute, he can write a get and divorce his wife with others supporting his writing. And so this doesn't just come up with a deaf mute, but this comes up in the case of even a blind person who never saw the luminaries now being a shliach tzibor and reciting this, or what about a deaf mute who can read the Megillah, for example? What about that? So the Gemara continues and says, one who hears but does not speak, he is considered competent in every respect. So again, we're talking about a deaf mute. We're talking about somebody who cannot hear and he cannot speak. And that's Aaron Yudah Leib in the background. And Baruch Hashem, he can speak, babble. He says the word challah, he says T. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha cited Rabbi Chia in his brisa, and he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that there are disputants to this teaching. This is going to be the teaching of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who's going to hold that a get written or given by someone who was initially competent and then became a deaf mute is not valid. And those disputants, who is that? That's going to be the Tanna Kama. Now, the Tanna Kama is going to be agreeing with the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, regarding Kiddushin. So the Tanna Kama of the earlier Baraisa was stating that a deaf mute, a deranged person, a minor, could never perform a valid act of Kiddushin. And the Rosh Cirilio says that this applies even if he was originally mentally competent, and then if a mentally or a competent individual is even going to be present to instruct him. And the Tanna Kama of this Baraisa is going to be saying that that's going to be the case of Kiddushin. And not only that, in this later Baraisa, it's going to be the same regarding Gitten and Truma. In other words, that even under guidance, and even if the person was not born this way but became this way, that they are not going to be able to do it. So the Tanna Kama takes the strict opinion, the strict view on this. Now, Rabbi Yochanan, the Amarah, is stating merely that there are disputants, and that's going to be to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion regarding the get. And the Gemara is identifying who are these disputants. It's going to be the rabbis, right? It's a Tanna Kama. And now they were disputing on Kiddushin. That's implying that nobody is going to be disputing Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in the context of the get. And the Gemara is going to question this. And they said in this Gemara, but the following Mishnah, that's going to be in Yevamos 14.1, that's page 112b in the Bavli, it says that they clearly dispute the view of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel with the context of a get. So if he, the husband who married the wife while he was mentally competent, became a deaf mute, or he became deranged after their marriage, he can never divorce her. That's what the Mishnah says. So the Mishnah initially stated that a deaf mute who marries a woman by communicating his intent with, say, sign language, as he was able to do so by a rabbinic enactment, he can also divorce her by communicating his intent with sign language. Now, this divorce is going to parallel the marriage. They're both valid by rabbinic decree. But then what it's stating is that in the clause here, that if a competent person marries and then becomes mentally incompetent, he can't divorce his wife. That's the next case. So since the marriage is effective under biblical law, it can't be annulled by a divorce that is effective only under rabbinic law. That's a very good point. So according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who's saying that the husband was originally competent, he should be able to write a get and give it to his wife with others supporting his writing. In other words, others that are going to be there instructing him how to do it and how to do it with the proper intent and how to give it. And so since this person was not born as a deaf mute, if you have a competent person who instructs him in giving and writing the get, that get should be valid according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, why does the Mishnah state that he can never divorce his wife? Well, maybe, and this is going to be insight by the Marafulda, maybe the Mishnah is going to disagree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and hold that even a deaf mute who was originally competent and then became a deaf mute later in life can't write and give a get, even, by the way, under the instruction of a competent person. So since this Mishnah is disputing Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel within the context of the get, why did Rabbi Yochanan and the Gemara not cite it explicitly? So the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, interpret this Mishnah as referring to a case where he does not know how to write. So in that case, then you have a case where there's nothing that the deaf mute can do to divorce his wife. Why? Because even if you instructed him, he can't hear it, and he can't ask questions about it, and he can't, how do you convey to an unlettered person, somebody who's unlettered, doesn't know what the letters are, he's completely illiterate, and you're going to teach a deaf mute how to write and to convey meaning? So that's going to be the specific case that this Mishnah is talking about. Now, the Gemara is going to ask another question. It's going to say, Rabbi Bar Mamel asked and says the following brisa, that it's going to be talking about the ability of a deaf mute to divorce his wife, and that's going to clearly dispute the view of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel within the context of Gitten. And the brisa states that consider a case where the husband wrote the orders with his handwriting, and he told the scribe to write, and the witnesses are going to be there and sign a get for my wife. So, in other words, is this get going to be valid now? And the law is, says this Gemara, that even though they write the get, they signed it, they gave it to him, and then he gave the get to his wife, it's not a valid get. Now, the brisa is talking about a deaf mute who wrote the instructions because he's unable to speak them. And since he's able to express himself in writing, it's obvious that we're dealing with a husband who was originally competent, and then he became a deaf mute later on. Now, the case, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, is what if you have a deaf mute who was unlettered, right? Illiterate. And if there's somebody illiterate, he's saying that Mishnah is talking about somebody who's illiterate, that they can never divorce their wife because in this process of trying to get divorced, you now have to teach somebody the meaning of writing and explain to them what it all means. And they can't ask questions, they can't hear, they can't get instruction or interact with it. So that's a very good nuance to know about, that Mishnah, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, is talking about an incompetent person who is also going to be illiterate. And so, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, if you have a person who's acting under the instruction of a competent person, and he can write a get, and the case over there would be he can divorce his wife. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that if the person is mentally incompetent or mute and deaf, and he, is illiterate, then even if he has instruction, he can't ever divorce her because he can never understand what he's writing. He can never get it. Even if he's making letters, he still doesn't have intention to understand it. So the idea here is that, what about here where you have the instruction of a competent person and he's writing the get, or he's ordering the get by writing, and now the witnesses are going to sign what the scribe wrote, and then he's going to take this and go give it to his wife and divorce it. And the Brisa is saying that in this case, that get is invalid. So in what case would it be valid? What case would it be invalid? And, clearly we have a case where it's not going to be like what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that in that context, if the deaf mute wrote the instructions to the scribe to divorce the wife and witnesses signed off on it, which is part of the process, and there was guidance and competent people were watching it, and now this deaf mute took that get and handed it, he's saying the woman's divorced. Tanakam is saying no, not divorced. So the Gemara is going to answer what the difference is, and Rabbi Yosei says that, look at the end of the Brisa, and you will see it does not necessarily dispute the view of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. The Brisa continues, says that it is not a valid get until they hear his voice, saying to the scribe, write, and to the witnesses, sign. Now, is it not ultimately true, says this Brisa, that the get is invalid unless they hear his voice? Rather, the law is that even if he nodded his head in the presence of the scribe and the witnesses to indicate his desire to create the get and to sign off on the get from the witnesses, that it would be valid. So why does the Brisa say that they have to hear the voice? So maybe you must say that, there's not a precise text here for the Brisa's later clause, talking about the voice, and therefore it would be reasonable to say that here too, this is not maybe going to be the precise text. So the question is, maybe this is not dealing with a case of a deaf mute, who obviously can't use his voice. Maybe a nod is going to be enough. Now, the Gemara objects to this interpretation of the Brisa. Rabbi Manis says, actually, we can say that there is precise text here, and in the Brisa's later clause talking about the voice, where it says that the witnesses need to hear his voice, and in truth, nodding would be enough, and that text would be correct, but for making one's voice heard is not the same as nodding his head, since in either case, the person communicates his intention. And since the text of the latter clause is correct, there's no basis to assume that the text of the first part of the clause is incorrect. Rather, it means that, understood fully, that if a person who becomes deaf and issues, or deaf mute, issues written instructions concerning a get, that get is invalid, even if he wrote the instructions under the guidance of a competent individual. And so that it would seem that this Brisa does dispute the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. To sum it up, says the Mara Fulda, that the Brisa's first clause teaches that if a person who became a deaf mute wrote direct orders to the scribe and to the witnesses to execute a get, that get is not valid. But by stating this unequivocally, that the Brisa teaches that it does apply even if he was instructed by a competent person. So this Brisa disputes the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and it holds that the action of a mentally incompetent person is invalid even when performed under the instructions of a competent person. And the Brisa is continuing with another clause stating that a get is valid only if the scribe and the witness hears the husband's voice instructing them to do this act. So in this case too, the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would be disputed. So in where it's talking about hearing the voice, and that would be like, well, what about if he nods? So is that going to count? So according to the Vilna Goan, the Bryce is ruling that someone who hears a deaf mute cannot issue written instructions to execute a get because his action is insufficient even when he's coached by a competent individual, but he can issue instructions by voice or by nodding. And nodding is equivalent to speaking because it is a means of communicating directly and immediately with the movement of a body. But writing, however, is not equivalent to speaking because it is not a direct and an immediate means of communication. And maybe one would not know what the person intends until he reads the script after the person has written it. So there's a lot of issues here on what's going to be the halacha lemaisa, and please do not take this as halacha lemaisa, and please always check the Shulchan Aruch, but and also qualified poskim, because there's a lot of issues going on over here. You have a lot of issues where some of the cases can be rabbinic, some of the cases can be deraita, some of the cases can't mix because you can't have rabbinic rules overriding deraita rules. And then there's a lot of issue about will and thought, and then legally significant action. And so definitely do not look at this as halacha lemaisa. But these are the issues that they are thinking about when they do come up with what exactly is the halacha lemaisa. Have a great day, and we will continue more tomorrow.